The morning sun cast golden rays through the ancient stained glass windows of Valeria Cathedral, painting rainbow patterns across the marble floor where Queen Isabella stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the delicate lace of her coronation gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk that had taken 12 seamstresses 6 months to complete. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy crown that would soon rest upon her head. Alexander paced nervously in the adjoining chamber, his ceremonial uniform perfectly pressed, but his mind anything but calm. Today marked the end of a year-long transition period following his father's peaceful abdication. The old king had stepped down gracefully, declaring it was time for fresh leadership in the modern age. Now, at 32, Alexander was ready to take the throne alongside his beloved wife of 5 years. "Your Majesty," whispered Lady Margaret, Isabella's closest advisor and childhood friend, "the Archbishop is ready for you both." Isabella took a deep breath, remembering her grandmother's words from years ago. "A true queen doesn't wear the crown, she becomes it." Those words had guided her through years of preparation, charity work, and learning the intricate protocols of royal life. She had studied everything from international diplomacy to the proper way to greet visiting dignitaries, but nothing had truly prepared her for this moment. The cathedral doors opened with a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the vast space. 2,000 guests rose to their feet as the royal couple entered. Isabella's heart raced as she saw the sea of faces before her: prime ministers, presidents, fellow royals from neighboring kingdoms, and representatives from every corner of Valeria society. Camera crews broadcast the ceremony to millions watching around the world. Alexander walked beside her with steady grace, though she could see the slight tension in his jaw that only she would notice after years of marriage. He had always been the more confident of the two in public settings, but today even he felt the enormity of their new roles. They had spent countless evenings discussing their vision for the kingdom, a more accessible monarchy that would bridge tradition with progress. Archbishop Thomas, a kind man in his 70s who had baptized Alexander as an infant, stood at the altar. His voice carried clearly through the cathedral as he began the ancient ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the coronation of Alexander James Frederick to be King of Valeria and Isabella Catherine Rose to be Queen of Valeria." The ceremony proceeded with rituals that dated back centuries. Alexander knelt before the altar as the archbishop anointed him with holy oil, symbolizing his divine appointment to serve the people. The St. Edward's crown of Valeria, made of solid gold and adorned with precious gems collected from across the kingdom's history, was lifted high before being placed upon his head. "I, Alexander, do solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of Valeria according to their respective laws and customs," he declared, his voice strong and clear. The weight of the crown was significant, but it was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he felt settling onto his shoulders. Isabella's turn came next. As she knelt, she thought of all the queens who had come before her. Some remembered for their wisdom, others for their compassion, and a few unfortunately recalled for their mistakes. She was determined to be remembered as a queen who made a difference. The queen's crown, slightly smaller but no less magnificent than her husband's, was placed upon her head with the same solemnity. "I, Isabella, pledge my life to the service of Valeria and its people, to uphold justice and mercy, and to be a faithful partner to my king in all endeavors," she vowed. Her voice carried clearly through the cathedral, and she felt a surge of determination replace her earlier nervousness. The congregation erupted in cheers as the archbishop presented the newly crowned monarchs. "I give you King Alexander and Queen Isabella of Valeria." The sound was deafening, centuries of tradition culminating in this single moment of transition. As they walked back down the aisle, now as king and queen, Isabella caught sight of her parents in the front row. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while her father, a simple schoolteacher who had never imagined his daughter would wear a crown, beamed with pride. It reminded her that beneath all the pageantry and protocol, this was still a deeply personal moment. The royal carriage waited outside the cathedral, its golden exterior polished to perfection and adorned with the royal coat of arms. Thousands of people lined the streets of the capital city, waving flags and cheering as the procession made its way to the palace. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view, while elderly citizens recalled attending similar celebrations decades earlier. Isabella waved to the crowds, her earlier nervousness completely gone. She could see genuine joy and excitement in the faces of the people, and it filled her with purpose. These were the people she and Alexander would serve, and their happiness meant everything to her. At the palace, the traditional balcony appearance awaited them. As they stepped onto the famous red balcony that had hosted royal announcements for generations, the roar of the crowd below was overwhelming. 50,000 people filled the palace square, their cheers echoing off the surrounding buildings. Alexander took Isabella's hand as they waved to their subjects. "How do you feel, my queen?" he whispered, barely audible over the noise. "Ready?" she whispered back, and meant it completely. The scared young woman who had entered the cathedral that morning was gone, replaced by someone who truly understood the magnitude of her role and embraced it fully. The celebration continued late into the evening, with a state banquet attended by dignitaries from around the world. But for Isabella, the most meaningful moment came much later, when she and Alexander finally retired to their private chambers. Sitting together on a simple couch, still wearing their crowns, but having changed out of their formal attire, they reflected on the day that had changed their lives forever. "Tomorrow the real work begins," Alexander said, looking out at the lights of the city below. Isabella nodded, feeling the weight of the crown on her head, a weight she would carry for the rest of her life, but one she was now ready to bear with grace and dignity. 3 weeks after their coronation, King Alexander and Queen Isabella faced their first major test as monarchs. A devastating earthquake had struck the northern province of Millbrook, leaving hundreds homeless and the local infrastructure in ruins. This would be their first official visit as king and queen, and the entire nation watched to see how their new leaders would respond to crisis. Isabella stood in her dressing room at dawn, selecting practical clothing instead of the elaborate gowns she had grown accustomed to wearing. Today called for sturdy boots, a warm coat, and clothes that could handle dirt and debris. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, had initially protested the casual attire, but Isabella was firm in her decision. "A queen should look like a queen," Sarah argued gently, holding up a more formal blue dress. "A queen should look like someone who cares more about her people than her appearance," Isabella replied, pulling on a simple gray sweater. She had spent hours the night before reading reports about the disaster, learning the names of affected villages, and studying the relief efforts already underway. Alexander was in the palace courtyard, reviewing security arrangements with his protection team. Unlike his father, who had always maintained a significant distance from the public during such visits, Alexander insisted on minimal barriers between himself and the people who needed to see their king. "Sir, we strongly recommend maintaining the standard 50-meter perimeter," urged Captain Morrison, head of royal security. 20 meters maximum," Alexander countered. "These people have lost everything. The last thing they need is to feel like their own king is afraid to get near them." The helicopter journey to Millbrook took 2 hours, flying over landscapes that told the story of the disaster. Cracked roads snaked between collapsed bridges, and entire hillsides had shifted, leaving homes tilted at impossible angles. Isabella pressed her face to the window, her heart breaking at the sight of the destruction below. Their first stop was a temporary shelter set up in the local school gymnasium. Families who had lost their homes were living on cots arranged in neat rows, their possessions reduced to whatever they had managed to grab in the terrifying minutes after the ground began to shake. As they entered the gymnasium, a hush fell over the room. Children peeked out from behind their parents, curious about these important visitors they had only seen on television. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in Millbrook for 83 years, was the first to approach. "Your Majesties," she said with a shaky curtsy, clearly unsure of the proper protocol. Isabella immediately went to her, taking both of the woman's hands in hers. "Please, just call me Isabella. Tell me about your home." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears as she described the house her late husband had built with his own hands 50 years earlier. "It's gone now, completely gone. 40 years of memories buried under a pile of rubble." Alexander knelt beside a young boy named Tommy, who was clutching a stuffed elephant that had clearly seen better days. "What's your elephant's name?" the king asked gently. "Mr. Peanuts," Tommy whispered. "He saved my life. When the shaking started, I grabbed him and ran outside just like Mama taught me." "Mr. Peanuts is a very brave elephant," Alexander said seriously. "And you were very smart to listen to your mother." For the next 3 hours, the royal couple moved through the shelter, stopping to talk with every family. Isabella helped serve lunch, despite protests from the volunteer coordinators who worried about protocols. Alexander sat on the floor with children, listening to their stories and drawing pictures with them on scraps of paper. The local mayor, James Fletcher, had been skeptical about the royal visit. He had seen too many politicians arrive for photo opportunities before disappearing again. But watching the king and queen genuinely engage with his constituents changed his perspective entirely. "They're not here for cameras," he whispered to his assistant. "They actually care." Indeed, Isabella had specifically requested that media access be limited. Only one photographer and one reporter were allowed, with the understanding that the focus should be on the community's needs, not royal fashion or protocol. Their next stop was the most damaged area of town, where houses had completely collapsed. Alexander and Isabella walked carefully through the debris-strewn streets, accompanied by emergency workers who pointed out the ongoing recovery efforts. They met volunteer crews who had been working around the clock to clear roads and search for survivors. Maria Santos, a nurse who had turned her undamaged home into a medical station, was treating a construction worker who had injured his hand while clearing debris. She looked up in surprise as the royal couple approached. "Your Majesties." "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were coming here," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please don't apologize," Isabella said. "You're doing exactly what needs to be done. How can we help?" For the next hour, Isabella assisted Maria with basic first aid, while Alexander helped carry supplies. The image of the Queen bandaging a worker's cut hand while the King loaded medical supplies into a van became the defining photo of their visit. But the most powerful moment came when they visited 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who was trapped under debris for 6 hours before being rescued. She was recovering in a makeshift hospital bed, her leg in a cast, but her spirits remarkably high. "Are you really the Queen?" Emma asked Isabella, her eyes wide with wonder. "I am, but more importantly, you're the bravest girl I've ever met," Isabella replied, sitting on the edge of the small bed. Emma's mother, Rosa, had been working 3 jobs to support her daughter after her husband died in a workplace accident 2 years earlier. Their apartment had been destroyed, and Rosa was overwhelmed by the task of rebuilding their lives. "I don't know how we'll manage," Rosa confided to Isabella. "Emma needs physical therapy for her leg, and I can't work while I'm taking care of her. But we have nowhere to live." Alexander overheard and immediately called his private secretary. Within minutes, arrangements were being made for the Royal Foundation to provide temporary housing and medical support for Emma's recovery. As the day continued, more and more stories of resilience and community spirit emerged. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers opening their homes to displaced families, and young people organizing supply drives. Isabella and Alexander were witnessing the very best of human nature in the face of tragedy. The final stop was a town meeting in the partially damaged community center. Local officials had expected a brief formal address from the king, but instead found themselves in an hour-long discussion about rebuilding plans, economic recovery, and long-term support needs. "We're not here to make speeches," Alexander told the gathered crowd. "We're here to listen and to understand what you need from your government." An elderly farmer named Robert stood up slowly. "Your Majesty, your father visited us once 20 years ago, after the floods. He gave a nice speech and left. We never saw any of the help he promised." The room went silent, everyone aware that Robert was challenging the king directly. Alexander nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Robert, you're absolutely right to be skeptical. Words without action are worthless. Before we leave today, you'll have specific commitments with timelines and contact information for follow-up. But more than that, we'll be back in 3 months to check on progress personally." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Royal visits were typically once-in-a-lifetime events, not regular occurrences. Isabella stood up beside her husband. "This community has shown us something beautiful today. You've shown us that even when everything falls apart, people can come together and rebuild something stronger. We want to be part of that rebuilding, not just observers." As their helicopter lifted off in the evening light, Isabella and Alexander looked down at the town below. Lights were beginning to twinkle in undamaged houses and the temporary shelters, signs that life was continuing despite the destruction. "That was nothing like I expected," Isabella said, exhaustion evident in her voice, but satisfaction in her smile. Alexander nodded, still processing everything they had experienced. "Father always said royal visits were about being seen by the people. I think it's actually about seeing the people." The flight back to the capital was quiet, both of them lost in thought about the day's experiences. They had gone to Millbrook as new monarchs wanting to show support for their subjects. They returned as leaders who had gained a deeper understanding of their role and responsibilities. 6 months into their reign, King Alexander and Queen Isabella faced their first major crisis. A scandal had erupted when leaked documents revealed that the previous government had made secret deals with foreign corporations, selling valuable mining rights for far below market value. The opposition party demanded that Alexander dissolve parliament and call immediate elections, while the current prime minister insisted the king should stay out of political matters entirely. Isabella sat in the palace library at midnight, surrounded by constitutional law books and legal opinions from the kingdom's top scholars. The heavy responsibility of making the right decision weighed on her mind. Alexander paced the room, running his hands through his hair as he had done since childhood, whenever he was deeply troubled. "The Constitution gives us the authority," Alexander said for the 10th time that evening. "But exercising it could set a dangerous precedent. And not exercising it when corruption is proven could make us look weak or complicit," Isabella replied, marking another passage in a legal text. She had spent the day meeting privately with constitutional experts, trying to understand all the implications of their decision. The scandal had broken 3 days earlier when investigative journalist David Chen published documents showing that mining contracts worth billions had been signed in secret, with no parliamentary oversight. The deals would allow foreign companies to extract rare minerals from Valeria's protected forests, potentially causing irreversible environmental damage. Prime Minister Hartwell had been in office for only 8 months and claimed he knew nothing about the deals, which were negotiated by his predecessor. But opposition leader Sarah Brooks argued that Hartwell's party had benefited from campaign contributions linked to the same corporations. Your Majesties cannot remain neutral when democracy itself is under attack, Brooks had argued during her private audience with them the previous day. The people have a right to know the truth, and they have a right to choose new leadership if they've lost confidence in the current government. But Hartwell had been equally forceful in his position. The monarchy must not interfere in political processes, he had insisted. These matters should be resolved through normal parliamentary procedures, not royal intervention. The pressure was immense. Editorial writers debated the proper role of the monarchy in modern times. Some argued that Alexander and Isabella should follow the example of ceremonial monarchs in other countries and stay completely out of political disputes. Others insisted that in times of crisis, the crown had a duty to protect democratic institutions. Isabella closed her book and looked at her husband. "What does your heart tell you?" Alexander stopped pacing and sat beside her on the old leather couch that had been his grandmother's favorite reading spot. "My heart tells me that those mining contracts will destroy forests that have stood for 1,000 years. My heart tells me that secret deals made without public knowledge aren't democracy. But our heads tell us that interfering could damage the monarchy's reputation permanently," Isabella said, voicing the concern they both shared. They had received calls from monarchs in friendly nations, some encouraging them to take action, while others warned against setting precedents that future governments might abuse. The king of neighboring Astoria had called personally to share his experience with a similar crisis decades earlier. "I chose to stay silent," King Charles of Astoria had confided. "I told myself I was protecting the institution of monarchy. But the corruption continued, and eventually the scandal grew so large that it brought down not just the government, but nearly brought down the crown as well. Sometimes doing nothing is the most dangerous choice of all." The next morning brought a development that forced their hand. Environmental protesters had begun camping outside the royal palace, demanding that Alexander and Isabella take action to protect the forests. At the same time, counter-protesters appeared, insisting that the king and queen stay out of politics. Isabella stood at her office window, watching the growing crowds below. Signs reading "Royal Duty" and "Stop Royal Interference" were visible side by side, a perfect symbol of the impossible position they found themselves in. "There's something else," Alexander said, entering with a folder in his hand. "Intelligence services have discovered that the mining deals include a clause allowing the foreign companies to bring in their own security forces. Essentially, we would have foreign military personnel on Valyrian soil." Isabella turned from the window, her decision crystallizing in her mind. "That changes everything. This isn't just about politics anymore. It's about sovereignty." They called an emergency meeting with their closest advisors. The discussion was heated, with opinions split down the middle. Lord Chancellor Williams, a veteran of 40 years in government service, strongly opposed royal intervention. "Your Majesties, the monarchy has survived for 800 years by staying above political disputes," he argued. "One crisis is not worth risking the institution itself." But Lady Margaret, Isabella's trusted friend, and now her private secretary, disagreed. "Staying above politics is a luxury we can afford when the system is working properly. When democracy is under attack, neutrality becomes complicity." After hours of debate, Alexander and Isabella made their decision. They would not dissolve Parliament immediately, but they would demand full disclosure of all documents related to the mining deals and require parliamentary debate before any contracts could be finalized. The announcement came at a televised address from the throne room, with both monarchs present to show their unified position. Isabella spoke first, her voice calm but firm. "Fellow citizens of Valyria, recent revelations have raised serious questions about decisions made in your name without your knowledge. As your queen, I believe you have the right to full transparency about agreements that will affect your country for generations to come." Alexander continued, "We are not taking sides in political disputes. We are taking the side of democratic principles and the sovereignty of our nation. We call upon Parliament to immediately investigate these contracts and to hold public hearings where all citizens can understand what has been proposed in their name." The reaction was immediate and intense. Prime Minister Hartwell's initial response was anger, but after consulting with his advisers, he agreed to the parliamentary investigation. Opposition leader Brooks praised the royal couple's courage, while being careful not to claim their support for her party specifically. More importantly, public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the royal intervention. Citizens across the political spectrum appreciated that their king and queen had acted on principle rather than political calculation. The parliamentary hearings that followed were dramatic and revealing. Witnesses testified about secret meetings, hidden payments, and pressure to approve contracts without proper environmental review. The foreign corporations, faced with public scrutiny they had hoped to avoid, eventually withdrew from the deals entirely. Prime Minister Hartwell survived the crisis, but several members of his government resigned. New environmental protection laws were passed with bipartisan support, and a constitutional amendment was approved, requiring public disclosure of all international agreements before they could be signed. 3 months later, Alexander and Isabella made another visit to Millbrook to check on the earthquake recovery progress, as they had promised. The town was bustling with construction activity, and new homes were rising where rubble had once stood. The temporary shelters had been replaced with a beautiful new community center. Emma Rodriguez, the young girl who had been trapped in the earthquake, ran up to greet them on her fully healed legs. "Your Majesties! Look, I can run again!" But it was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had lost her family home, who provided the most meaningful moment. She approached Isabella with tears in her eyes, carrying a small potted plant. "Your Majesty, this oak seedling came from my old garden. It's the only thing that survived when my house collapsed. I've been growing it in a pot, waiting for the right place to plant it." She handed the pot to Isabella. "I'd like you to plant this in the palace gardens if you would, so something beautiful from Millbrook will always be growing there, reminding you of us." Isabella accepted the plant with both hands, understanding the deep symbolism of the gift. "Mrs. Patterson, this will have a place of honor in our garden, and every time we see it grow, we'll remember the strength and resilience of the people of Millbrook." That evening, as Alexander and Isabella planted the oak seedling together in the palace garden, they reflected on their journey from nervous new monarchs to confident leaders who had found their voice. "Do you think we made the right choice about the mining contracts?" Alexander asked, patting soil around the tiny tree. Isabella smiled, remembering the scared young woman who had trembled before her coronation just 8 months earlier. "I think we made the choice that felt true to who we want to be as leaders. History will judge whether it was right." Alexander nodded, looking out over the lights of the capital city. "Father always said that being king meant making decisions other people couldn't or wouldn't make. I finally understand what he meant." The oak seedling was small and fragile, but its roots were already beginning to take hold in the rich palace soil. Like their rain, it would need time, care, and patience to grow into something strong and lasting. But the foundation was solid, and the future looked bright. In the months that followed, Alexander and Isabella continued to define their reign through actions rather than words. They maintained the traditions that connected them to their history while adapting their roles to serve a modern democracy. The mining scandal became a defining moment that established their credibility as leaders who would put principle above convenience. Years later, historians would mark their handling of the crisis as the moment when the monarchy evolved into its modern form. Still ceremonial, but willing to defend democratic institutions when necessary. The oak tree from Millbrook grew tall and strong in the palace garden, its branches eventually providing shade for future generations of royal children who would play beneath it, learning through stories about the king and queen who planted it, after learning that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to act when it would be easier to remain silent.